The gymnasium had been transformed with white lights and paper banners, the kind of decoration that tried to make a basketball court look like something out of a dream. And Matthew Hayes stood near the punch table with his hands in his pockets, watching his 8-year-old daughter Emma spin slowly in her good dress, the one with the small embroidered flowers on the collar, taking in the strange spectacle of grown adults pretending to be 17 again. He had almost not come. He had told himself 3 times in the car that turning around was still an option, that nobody would notice if the name Matthew Hayes simply never showed up on the sign-in sheet. But Emma had wanted to see the school her dad talked about sometimes, the one with the oak tree out front where he said he used to eat lunch. And so he had put on the blue button-down that still fit him the way it had a decade ago, and he had walked in holding his daughter's hand like a man walking into water he wasn't sure was warm or cold. That was when the doors at the far end of the gym opened, and the noise of the room seemed to dip for just a moment, the way a room does when something unexpected walks into it, and Olivia Brooks stepped through wearing black. Not a little black dress meant for an evening out, but the kind of black that had weight to it, the kind that people wore when the color wasn't a fashion choice but a fact of their life. And Matthew felt his chest go tight, before his mind had even finished processing that it was her. 20 years had changed the shape of her face only slightly, softened it in the way that time does, but her eyes were exactly the eyes he remembered from a hallway locker and a promise made under bleachers he had never quite let go of. And before he could take a single step toward her, before either of them had said a single word, a small girl with dark curls and Olivia's same searching eyes broke away from her mother's side and crossed the gym floor with the fearless directness that only children have, walked straight up to Matthew and reached for his hand. He looked down, startled, his fingers instinctively curling around hers before his brain caught up to what was happening. And the girl looked up at him with an expression far too solemn for someone so small, and she said, "Mom said you'd come." Somewhere behind her, a paper cup slipped from someone's hand and hit the gym floor with a small hollow clatter that nobody but Matthew seemed to hear, because everyone else in the room was still watching Olivia Brooks stand frozen in the doorway in her widow's black, watching a version of her past reach out and take her daughter's offered hand, like it was the most natural thing in the world. To find out how a woman who once walked out of Matthew's life would walk back into it through the small hand of a child neither of them had planned for, and what it would cost both of them to let themselves hope again, stay until the very end. If stories like this one, about people finding each other again after life has already taken so much, are the kind that stay with you long after the video ends, we would love for you to tell us in the comments, because so many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves. And this little corner of the internet exists because of the people who show up here to share that with us. There is an old and quiet argument, one you will recognize the moment you hear it, about whether two people who were pulled apart by other people's expectations ever really owe it to themselves to try again, or whether some doors, once closed by family and circumstance, are simply meant to stay closed for good. And you may find yourself picking a side before this story is even half over. 20 years earlier, none of this exists yet. There is no gymnasium decorated in white lights, no widow's black dress, no small girl with searching eyes crossing a room to take a stranger's hand. There is only a high school hallway in a town called Ridgemont, and a boy named Matthew Hayes who works the evening shift at his uncle's hardware store to help his mother with rent, and a girl named Olivia Brooks whose family owns 40 acres of vineyard on the hillside outside of town, land that has belonged to the Brooks family for 3 generations. And the two of them are inseparable in the particular, all-consuming way that only teenagers can be, meeting under the bleachers after his shifts, trading dog-eared paperbacks, talking about a future they have already half built together, without either of them quite admitting it out loud. Matthew's mother works 2 jobs and still cannot always make the light bill. And Olivia's parents, kind but proud people who built something out of raw hillside and stubbornness, have plans for their daughter that do not include a boy whose family has nothing to offer a vineyard that has survived droughts and recessions and one very bad decade in the 80s. Nobody says it cruelly, Olivia's father simply sits Matthew down one evening on the porch of the Brooks farmhouse, offers him a glass of sweet tea, and explains, gently but without any real room for negotiation, that Olivia has a future that needs protecting, and that a boy working nights at a hardware store is not part of that future, not because he isn't a good boy, but because good is not always enough when there is 100 years of family history riding on every decision a Brooks makes. Matthew, 17 and proud in the particular way that poor boys learn to be proud, does not argue. He nods, finishes his tea, and walks the 2 miles home in the dark. And 3 weeks later, when Olivia's family accepts a position for her father managing a vineyard partnership 2 states away, Matthew does not ask her to stay, and she does not ask him to fight for her, and the two of them let 100 years of somebody else's history decide the next 50 years of their own. Matthew Hayes builds a quiet life. He becomes a contractor, good with his hands the way his father was before he left. Meets a woman named Claire in his late 20s who loves him with an easy, uncomplicated warmth, and together they have a daughter they name Emma. And for a while Matthew believes he has simply skipped past the chapter of his life that included Olivia Brooks entirely, filed it away as a beautiful thing that belonged to someone he used to be. Then, 3 years before the reunion, Claire is diagnosed with an illness that moves faster than anyone tells them it will, and within 11 months, Matthew is a 36-year-old widower raising a 5-year-old alone, learning to braid hair from internet videos at midnight and burning more dinners than he successfully cooks, carrying a grief he does not talk about because there is no one left in the house to talk about it with, except a child too young to carry it alongside him. He does not think about Olivia Brooks during those years, or he tells himself he doesn't. The way a person tells themselves they don't think about a scar simply because they have stopped looking at it directly. Olivia's road runs differently but arrives at a similar kind of solitude. She marries a man named Richard Ellison a decade after leaving Ridgemont, a charming, ambitious man who sweeps into her life with promises about expanding the Brooks family vineyard into something bigger than her grandfather ever dreamed. And for a while it seems to work. The vineyard modernizing, new equipment arriving, new contracts signed. She gives birth to Daisy and believes, for a handful of good years, that she has built the very thing her father once sacrificed her first love to protect. But Richard's ambition, it turns out, runs on more than charm, and behind the modernized equipment and the signed contracts sits a mountain of debt. Olivia does not learn about until the night Richard's car goes off a wet mountain road 8 months before the reunion, leaving her a 38-year-old widow with a 2-year-old daughter, a vineyard whose paperwork she is only beginning to understand, and a grief made sharper by the discovery that the life she thought she had been living was not entirely the life she had actually been given. She had almost not come to the reunion either. It was Daisy, in the end, who convinced her, because Olivia had made the mistake, in her loneliest nights over the past 3 years, of telling her small daughter stories about a boy from Ridgemont with careful hands and a quiet voice, the boy she had once planned to marry before the world decided otherwise. And Daisy had listened to those stories the way children listen to fairy tales, filing away a name and a feeling, and when her mother mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was a reunion coming up in the town where that boy used to live, Daisy had looked up with an expression of absolute certainty and said only 4 words: "He is going to come." 14 months would pass between the day Richard Ellison's car left that mountain road and the night his widow would walk back into a high school gymnasium and watch her daughter cross the floor toward a man neither of them had planned on seeing again, and neither Olivia nor Matthew had any idea, standing in that gym under the paper banners and the white lights, just how much the next year of their lives was about to be rearranged by 2 little girls who had already decided, in the uncomplicated way that children do, exactly how this story was supposed to go. The moment Daisy's hand slipped from Matthew's, the room seemed to remember how to move again, conversations resuming in a low hum around them, and Olivia crossed the gym floor the way a person walks, when their legs have made the decision before their mind has caught up. And she stopped a few feet from Matthew, close enough that Emma, standing quietly beside her father, could see the way her mother's old classmate seemed to have forgotten, briefly, how to form words. "Matthew," Olivia said, and it wasn't a question, it was simply his name, spoken the way you might say the name of a place you hadn't been back to in 20 years and weren't sure still existed the way you remembered it. He said her name back, and for a moment the two of them simply stood there, two people who had once known each other's futures and had somehow ended up, decades later, standing in the same gymnasium, with children who had never met before that night, already reaching for each other's hands the way old friends do, Emma looking at Daisy with the particular fascination one shy child reserves for another, and Daisy looking back with the easy confidence of a girl who had already decided, based entirely on her mother's stories, that this family was going to matter to her. They did not fall into each other's arms. They did not cry or laugh or say any of the things that 20 years of unspoken history might have justified. Instead, they did something quieter and, in its own way, more honest. They stood together near the punch table for the better part of an hour while the reunion moved around them, and they talked about ordinary things, about Matthew's contracting business and Olivia's vineyard, about Emma's love of drawing horses and Daisy's insistence that she was going to be a veterinarian, and neither one mentioned Claire or Richard by name, though the absence of both hung quietly in the space between their sentences, understood without needing to be spoken. It was Olivia who eventually excused herself gently, saying she needed to get Daisy home for bedtime, and as she gathered her daughter's small hand in her own, she turned back to Matthew and said, in a voice pitched carefully between casual and something else entirely, that the vineyard tasting room did private tours on weekends now, if he and Emma ever wanted to see it. He said maybe. He meant yes. What neither of them said out loud that night, because neither of them yet knew the full shape of it, was how much trouble waited for Olivia back at the vineyard, trouble that had been quietly accumulating for the entire 14 months since Richard's death, trouble that Olivia had been managing alone, with the particular exhausted competence of a woman who has decided that falling apart is a luxury she cannot yet afford. The following Tuesday, Olivia sat across a conference table from a man named Gregory Vance, a business partner Richard had brought into the vineyard's operations 3 years earlier, a man with an expensive watch and an expensively reasonable manner, and Gregory explained to her, with the practiced patience of someone delivering bad news he has delivered many times before, that Richard had taken out a series of loans against the vineyard's land itself, using the deed as collateral to fund equipment purchases and expansion plans that had never quite generated the returns he'd promised, and that the total owed now sat just under $600,000. With the first major payment due in 90 days. Gregory offered, almost gently, to buy out Olivia's remaining stake at a price that would clear the debt and leave her with what he called a fair sum to start fresh. And it was only after Olivia left that meeting, sitting alone in her car in the parking lot, with her hands still on the steering wheel, that she allowed herself to fully understand what Gregory's offer actually meant. He was not offering to save the vineyard. He was offering to buy the very hillside her great-grandfather had cleared by hand, at a price that would leave her family's 100-year legacy in the possession of a man who had never once picked a grape from those vines. She did not tell Matthew about any of it, not at first, because 3 years of managing grief alone had taught her a particular kind of self-sufficiency that did not easily make room for asking anyone for help, least of all a man she had allowed herself exactly one evening of hope with. Instead, she threw herself into the vineyard's books late into the night after Daisy had gone to sleep, trying to understand loan documents written in language designed to be understood only by the people who drafted them. And it was during one of these long nights, 3 weeks after the reunion, that Daisy wandered downstairs in her pajamas, unable to sleep, and found her mother crying quietly over a stack of papers at the kitchen table for the first time since the week Richard died. Daisy did not fully understand what the papers meant, but she understood the shape of her mother's shoulders, and the next morning, without telling Olivia, she asked to use her mother's phone at the school pickup line, having memorized the number from a conversation 2 weeks earlier when Olivia had exchanged contacts with Matthew just in case Emma wants a playdate, and Daisy typed out, in the careful, misspelled way of a 7-year-old, a message that said simply, "Mama is sad about the papers, can you come?" Matthew received that message on a Thursday afternoon while measuring a doorframe on a job site 2 towns over, and he stood there for a long moment reading it 3 times. feeling something in his chest tighten in a way he recognized from years of being the only adult in a house. The particular ache of watching someone try to carry too much alone. He did not call Olivia that day. He understood, in the way that quiet men often understand things without needing them explained, that a woman as proud as Olivia Brooks would not thank a man for barging into her crisis uninvited, especially not a man she had once let go without a fight. So instead, he waited 2 days, and on Saturday, he showed up at the vineyard with Emma, ostensibly for the private tour Olivia had mentioned at the reunion, and it was only after the girls had run off toward the barn to look at the vineyard's aging dog, and Olivia and Matthew stood alone at the edge of the tasting room deck overlooking the hillside rows, that he said, quietly, without accusation, that Daisy had reached out to him, and that he wasn't asking her to explain anything she didn't want to explain, but that if there was trouble, he had spent 15 years building things and fixing things for people who didn't know how to fix them themselves, and he would like, if she'd let him, to at least look at whatever was wrong. Olivia stood very still for a long moment, looking out over the vines that had been in her family for 100 years. Vines her late husband had nearly signed away without her knowledge. And something in her, some wall she had been holding up since the night of Richard's accident, cracked just slightly at the edges. "It's not the kind of thing you can fix with a hammer," she said finally, and there was no bitterness in it, only exhaustion. "It's $600,000 and a man named Gregory Vance who wants my grandfather's land." Matthew didn't flinch at the number. He simply nodded, the way he nodded at problems on job sites that other men found overwhelming, and said that he didn't know anything about vineyard debt. But he knew a few things about contracts and liens from years of dealing with them in construction, and that if she would let him read through what she had, he would at least understand what she was up against, even if he couldn't solve it himself. It wasn't a rescue, it wasn't a declaration. It was simply one steady person offering to stand next to another steady person who had been standing alone for far too long, and Olivia, who had spent 14 months being strong for everyone including herself, found that she did not have the strength left to refuse. 3 months would pass before either of them fully understood how deep Gregory Vance's plans for the Brooks Vineyard actually ran, and by the time they did, it would no longer be a question of paperwork alone. Matthew came back the following Tuesday evening, after Emma had gone down for the night at his mother's house, and Daisy had been tucked into bed by Olivia, and he sat at the same kitchen table where Daisy had once found her mother crying, with a banker's box of documents Olivia had finally handed over, and he began reading through them with the same methodical patience he brought to a set of blueprints, looking for the load-bearing details buried under legal language. It took him 4 evenings, spread across 2 weeks, to understand what he was looking at, and what he found troubled him in a way that went beyond simple bad debt. The loans Richard had taken out were structured strangely, with balloon payments clustered suspiciously close to a date roughly 90 days out, the same window Gregory Vance had mentioned to Olivia in their meeting, and buried in an addendum that Olivia herself had apparently never been shown. Matthew found a clause granting Gregory Vance's company right of first refusal on the property, should the loans go into default, at a price that had been fixed 2 years earlier, and now sat dramatically below the land's current market value. It wasn't just bad luck or bad business. Someone had built a trap, slowly, patiently, and had been waiting for the right moment to close it. Olivia's reaction when Matthew laid it out for her was not the shock he expected. It was something quieter and more painful, a kind of grief layered over grief, because it meant that somewhere in the last years of her marriage, either through willful blindness or genuine deception, Richard had helped set the trap that now threatened to take her family's land, and she would never get to ask him why. "I keep thinking there has to be an explanation," she told Matthew that night, staring at the papers spread across her kitchen table. Some version of this where he wasn't just careless, where he didn't know what Vance was really doing. Matthew, who understood something about the particular loneliness of unanswerable questions left behind by the dead, did not try to comfort her with false reassurance. He simply said that whatever Richard had or hadn't known, the debt was real now, and the question in front of them wasn't about the past. It was about whether there was still a way to save the vineyard in the 90 days they had left. and that he intended to help her find out if she would let him. It was around this same time, as Matthew and Olivia began quietly building a case against the terms of the loan, that a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had worked as the vineyard's bookkeeper for 11 years and had known Olivia's father before her, came to Olivia one evening looking as though she had not slept in days. Patricia confessed, haltingly, that she had noticed irregularities in the loan paperwork nearly 2 years earlier, small inconsistencies in Gregory Vance's disbursement records that never quite added up, but that Richard had told her, when she raised it, that everything was under control and that questioning it further would only cause problems for everyone's jobs. And Patricia, a single mother herself, with a mortgage of her own to protect, had let it go, had told herself it wasn't her place, and had carried the guilt of that silence quietly for 2 years while watching Olivia grieve a husband she didn't fully understand. "I should have told you the day he died," Patricia said, her voice breaking. "I should have told you a year before that." Olivia, who might once have responded to this confession with anger, found instead that she understood it completely. Understood the particular fear of a person trying to protect what little security they had, and she told Patricia that she forgave her, and asked only that she help now. By pulling together every record she could find of the irregularities she'd noticed, because they were going to need every piece of evidence they could gather. There is an old and familiar question that people who have loved and lost tend to argue about long after the loss itself, the question of whether a grieving person is better served by being left alone to heal in their own time, or whether the people who love them owe it to them to show up uninvited, to insert themselves gently but persistently into a grief they haven't been asked to share. And Matthew Hayes, watching Olivia Brooks fight for the last piece of her family's history, with a steadiness that masked how frightened she actually was, found himself firmly convinced that some kinds of love simply do not wait to be invited, that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is show up anyway, and let the grieving person decide later whether they're grateful for it. The secondary crisis arrived 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, in the form of a letter from Gregory Vance's attorney, informing Olivia that, due to what the letter called irregularities in property maintenance and tax filings from the prior year, Vance's company was accelerating its timeline, moving the default deadline up by 6 weeks instead of the 90 days originally discussed. A legal maneuver Matthew recognized immediately as a pressure tactic designed to force Olivia into a hasty, disadvantageous settlement before she had time to properly organize a defense. Olivia read the letter standing in her kitchen with Daisy doing homework at the table nearby, and for the first time since the funeral, she felt something close to panic rise in her chest. The particular panic of watching a door that was already nearly shut swing even further closed. She called Matthew that night, later than she normally would have, and when he answered, she did not bother with pleasantries. "He's moved up the deadline," she said. 6 weeks. "I don't think we have enough time." Matthew was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same steadiness it always did. The voice of a man who had spent his whole life being the calm center of other people's storms. "Then we don't sleep much for 6 weeks," he said. But we're not giving him this without a fight. What neither of them yet knew, as Olivia hung up the phone that night feeling, for the first time in 14 months, something dangerously close to hope, was that the fight ahead of them would require Matthew to step forward in a way he had spent years avoiding, using skills and a history he had buried alongside a version of himself he thought he'd left behind long ago, and that the coming 6 weeks would reveal not only the truth about Gregory Vance, but a truth about Matthew that even Olivia did not yet know. What Olivia did not know about Matthew Hayes, because he had never had a reason to mention it, was that before he became a contractor, before Claire, before Emma, he had spent 2 years in his 20s working for a regional agricultural lending office, reviewing land collateral loans for family farms and vineyards across 3 counties, a job he'd taken not out of passion but out of necessity, to pay down debt from his mother's medical bills after his own father left, and that he had left the job only because the long hours had made it impossible to be present the way he'd wanted to be once he and Claire started their family. It was a chapter of his life he rarely mentioned, filed away the same way he'd filed away Ridgemont and Olivia Brooks, But sitting across from Patricia Alvarez's stack of records on a Sunday afternoon with 6 weeks on the clock, Matthew found himself recognizing the shape of Gregory Vance's scheme with an unsettling clarity, the specific language, the specific structure of the balloon payments, the specific way the right of first refusal clause had been worded to survive a cursory legal review, while still functioning, in practice, as a mechanism to strip the land away below market value the moment Olivia missed a single payment. He explained it to Olivia in careful, specific terms. Vance's company had structured the loan not as a genuine investment in the vineyard's expansion, but as what agricultural lenders sometimes called a collateral squeeze, where the borrower is encouraged to take on debt structured around a deadline timed to a low season in the business. In this case, the vineyards typically lean early spring cash flow, ensuring the borrower would be cash poor at precisely the moment the balloon payment came due. The addendum granting right of first refusal, Matthew explained, was almost certainly unenforceable as written, because it failed to include a legally required independent appraisal clause, a detail buried in agricultural lending statutes that most general business attorneys focused on the larger loan structure would likely overlook entirely. It wasn't a guarantee, he told her, but it was a real opening, a genuine flaw in the trap Vance had built, and it meant that instead of negotiating from a position of desperation, they could go to Vance's attorney with a challenge to the entire clause's enforceability. Olivia hired an attorney named Diane Kessler, a sharp, no-nonsense woman recommended by a friend of Patricia's, and together Matthew, Patricia, and Diane spent the next 4 weeks building a formal challenge, cross-referencing every disbursement record Patricia had saved, documenting every irregularity, and preparing a filing that would not only challenge the right of first refusal clause, but would formally allege that Gregory Vance had structured the original loans in bad faith. During this stretch, Matthew's presence in Olivia's life shifted from occasional visitor to something closer to a fixture, arriving most evenings after his own workday ended to comb through paperwork at her kitchen table. And it was during these long, quiet evenings, with Emma and Daisy doing homework or drawing at the far end of the table, that Olivia began to notice something she hadn't let herself notice before. The way Matthew never once made her feel small for not understanding the financial language on her own. The way he explained things patiently without a trace of condescension. The way he seemed to genuinely enjoy the ordinary chaos of two little girls arguing over crayon colors nearby while he worked. It was, she realized one night after he'd left, exactly the kind of quiet, steady presence her father had once decided, 20 years earlier, that Matthew Hayes could never provide. The reveal came on a Tuesday morning, in a conference room at Diane Kessler's office, when Gregory Vance arrived with his own attorney, expecting a routine negotiation over settlement terms, and instead found himself facing a formal legal challenge backed by 2 years of documented irregularities, an expert breakdown of his loan structure delivered by a man he clearly did not expect to find in the room, and a direct allegation of predatory lending practices that, if pursued publicly, could expose Vance's company to scrutiny well beyond this single vineyard. Vance's composure, so carefully maintained in every previous interaction, cracked visibly for the first time, his polished corporate language giving way to something sharper and more defensive, as he accused Olivia of stalling, accused Matthew of overstepping, insisted the original agreement stood exactly as written. But Diane Kessler, unmoved, simply slid the missing appraisal clause across the table and asked Vance's attorney calmly whether he'd like a moment to review it with his client before they proceeded further, and the look that passed between Vance and his attorney, the barely concealed alarm, told Olivia everything she needed to know. They had not expected anyone to look this closely, and now that someone had, the entire foundation Vance had built his scheme on was beginning to buckle. Vance did not concede that day. He left the meeting with his attorney promising further review, his composure only partially reassembled, and for the following 2 weeks, an uneasy silence stretched between the two sides, Olivia's hope tempered by the exhausting uncertainty of not knowing which way it would break. It was during this tense stretch that Daisy, sensing something was still wrong even though the adults tried to shield her from the details, asked Matthew one evening, with the blunt honesty only a 7-year-old can manage, whether the bad man was going to take their vineyard, and Matthew, kneeling down to her level, told her the truth as gently as he could, that some things take time to fix, and that grown-ups were working very hard on it, and that whatever happened, she and her mother were not facing it alone anymore. Daisy considered this for a long moment, then nodded with the particular solemnity she seemed to reserve for the most important conversations, and said, "Mom said you'd fix it. She was right about you coming too." 10 days later, on a Thursday afternoon that neither Matthew nor Olivia would ever describe as ordinary again, Diane Kessler's office received a call from Gregory Vance's attorney requesting an urgent meeting, and the tone of that request, hurried and stripped of its usual corporate composure, told Olivia before she even walked through the door that whatever was coming next was going to change everything. The meeting took place on a Friday morning, and this time, Gregory Vance himself did not appear, sending only his attorney, a tired-looking man who opened the conversation not with negotiation but with disclosure. An internal review, prompted by the threat of the formal complaint Diane Kessler had filed, had uncovered that Vance's company had structured similar predatory loan agreements against 2 other family-owned vineyards in the region over the past 4 years, both of which had already defaulted and lost their land under nearly identical circumstances, and that Vance, facing the very real possibility of a multi-property investigation and the public exposure that would come with it, was prepared to void the entire loan structure against the Brooks Vineyard, forgive the outstanding balance in exchange for Olivia's agreement not to pursue further legal action, and quietly walk away from the deal his company had built to take her family's land. Olivia sat very still when she heard this, feeling something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 14 months finally begin, slowly, to loosen, and when she looked over at Matthew sitting beside her, steady as he had been every single evening at her kitchen table, she understood that this victory, this restoration of everything her great-grandfather had built, existed because a quiet man with careful hands had chosen, again and again, to show up. The truth of what Vance had done to 2 other families did not stay quiet for long. Diane Kessler, with Olivia's blessing, referred the pattern of predatory lending to the State Agricultural Commission, and within weeks, a local news outlet picked up the story, running a piece on family vineyards being systematically targeted through deceptive loan structures. And Olivia, though she never sought the spotlight herself, agreed to speak briefly on the record, not to claim credit or vindication, but because she thought of Patricia's 2 years of silent guilt, and decided that the 2 other families who had already lost their land deserved to know they hadn't simply been unlucky, that something deliberate had been done to them, and that someone, finally, was saying so out loud. It was, in its own way, the public justice the story had been building toward, not a courtroom triumph or a dramatic confrontation, but the quiet unraveling of a scheme brought into the light because one grieving widow had refused to let herself be swept aside a second time. When Diane Kessler, in the weeks that followed, mentioned that Olivia would likely be eligible for a formal commendation from the State Agricultural Commission for her role in exposing the broader pattern of fraud, along with a modest financial award tied to the case, Olivia surprised everyone in the room by declining the commendation itself, asking only that whatever recognition existed be redirected toward funding a small legal aid fund for family farms and vineyards facing similar predatory lending, so that the next Patricia Alvarez, who noticed something wrong, might have somewhere real to turn instead of carrying that fear alone for 2 years. It was a decision that echoed, without either of them naming it, the way Matthew had quietly declined Diane's suggestion weeks earlier that he formally bill for his time reviewing the loan documents, telling her simply that he hadn't done it for payment. He'd done it because Daisy had asked him to come, and because some debts aren't measured in dollars. The quiet coda arrived 4 months later, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in early autumn, with the vineyard's harvest finally complete and the crushed grape must fermenting in the same barrels Olivia's grandfather had once filled by hand. Matthew had come by as he now did most weekends, and the 2 of them stood together on the tasting room deck overlooking the hillside rows, watching Emma and Daisy chase the vineyard dog between the vines below, both girls laughing in the particular unguarded way children do when they have decided, without needing anyone's permission, that they belong exactly where they are. Olivia held 2 glasses of the vineyard's own wine, pressed from the very harvest that had nearly been signed away to Gregory Vance, and handed one to Matthew. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, simply watching the late afternoon light settle gold across the rows their 2 very different lives had somehow, 20 years and 2 griefs later, led them both back to. "My father thought you weren't enough," Olivia said finally, not with bitterness, but with the soft clarity of someone finally able to name an old wound without it hurting the way it once did. He thought this land needed someone with more to offer than steady hands and a good heart. Matthew didn't answer right away, turning the glass slowly in his fingers, watching the girls below chase each other through the last rows of the season. "Steady hands kept the land," he said finally, quiet as always. "Maybe that was always going to be enough. It just took the right people a while to see it. If there is someone in your own life who was underestimated the way Matthew was, someone written off before anyone bothered to look closely enough to see what they actually carried, a quiet coworker, a steady neighbor, a parent who showed up again and again without ever asking for credit, we would love for you to tell us about them in the comments, even if it's simply to finally give them the recognition they deserved and never quite got. And if you believe, as this story does, that the quiet, overlooked people in our lives are so often the ones holding everything steady while nobody's watching, we hope you'll consider staying part of this story with us, subscribing so you don't miss the next one, because there is always another overlooked hero out there whose moment simply hasn't come yet. Weeks later, on the deck of a vineyard that had nearly been lost and instead had been saved by a debt no one could put a number on, 2 little girls fell asleep in the back seat of a truck on the drive home, hands still loosely clasped between the seats the way they so often were now. And in the front seat, 2 people who had once led 100 years of somebody else's history decide their future finally let themselves believe, quietly and without fanfare, that this time, the choice belonged to no one but them. The vines would need pruning again come winter. The girls would start 2nd and 3rd grade together in the fall. And somewhere in that ordinary, unremarkable stretch of road home, Matthew Hayes reached over and took Olivia Brooks's hand, the way he probably should have in some other version of this story, 20 years before, and neither of them let go.